Hey, welcome to the 34th DEM I Wonder webinar. DEM has so many services, offerings, programs, and hidden gems that we want to share with all of you, so we are excited to take just a few minutes to highlight these features in our webinar. The Utah Division of Emergency Management is hosting this webinar series aimed at providing local emergency managers with relevant content and opportunities to enhance their capabilities. Webinars are live for Q&A and are recorded for later viewing on the DEM website and the YouTube channel. Some of these webinars are seminars or workshops with a hands-on portion, which allow all emergency managers to become oriented to a DEM process or just a DEM product. So our schedule today will be as follows. We will start with our ground rules and etiquette. Next, we will have a brief presentation by Josh on I wonder how can I use situational awareness tools in my EOC. Following the presentation, the presenter will be available for a Q&A session. Following the Q&A, we'll close with a short message about the upcoming webinars. So the ground rules today are fairly simple. Please mute your line while the presenter is presenting. If you have a question, you may type it in the group chat or unmute at the appropriate time to ask your question. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. So thank you all for your attendance today. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Josh.
All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Josh Grunewald. I'm the GIS coordinator for the Utah Division of Emergency Management. And I've got a few things to present today related to using situational awareness tools in your EOC. Since my background and expertise are in GIS, it's a fairly GIS-centric presentation, but I'm certainly not trying to present any of these tools as the be-all, end-all for situational awareness. We certainly have a lot of tools in our toolbox that we can use, and the tools that I'm going to present today are just examples of ways that you could leverage GIS as part of collecting and gathering situational awareness in your EOC. For this presentation today, I've just got a presentation and then we can do Q&A at the end. I don't have any hands-on demo portion for today. I think most of the material that I'll cover will be reasonably self-explanatory, but certainly at the end, I'll be happy to field some questions. So with that, we'll go into a little bit of what we're going to cover today. We'll talk about ways that you can apply GIS generally in emergency management. We'll also highlight some data feeds that you can use. And we'll talk a little bit about using GIS for damage assessment. And we can also give you some practical steps for ways that you could start leveraging GIS in your organization. Certainly, many of you are well connected with the GIS experts in your community. And I'm certainly thankful for that. And I've seen a lot of really cool products coming out of the GIS community around the state in the last couple of years. So I know that many of you are already doing this, and many of you have had some really positive experiences. And so I'm hoping that we can share some tips and tricks that might be helpful for you moving forward. So with that, we'll start off with just some general applications of GIS and emergency management. There's probably many more applications that you could use with GIS other than these four things, but I think some of the most straightforward applications that you could use in your organization would be collecting data, doing some analysis and visualization of the data, using that data to share with your partners and disseminate it to your community, and also using some tools to be more of a communication tool to show how an incident has impacted your community. Certainly many of these ideas go hand in hand. But we'll start off taking a look at data collection. With the incidents that we've experienced around the state in the past couple of years with the pandemic and the windstorm in September of 2020 and the Magna earthquake and many others, we've seen a lot of increased need to collect data from folks out in the field. And there have been a lot of really interesting examples of communities that have stood up a Survey 123 form or other sorts of web forms to allow, in many cases, allow public citizens to submit damages that have happened either at their home or in their neighborhood or in their local area. And the Survey 123 forms are pretty easy to set up and straightforward to use. Certainly Survey 123 is not the only mobile data collection tool, but within the GIS world, it tends to be one of the more regularly used applications. And with the examples that we've got on the screen, for the windstorm in September of 2020, there were examples of data collection forms from Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County and Davis County. There may have been others, but those were the ones that we were the most aware of in our state EOC. And it was a really great tool just to allow members of the public to take a quick picture and say, here's what's happening in my area. And that was really cool to see. And on the next slide, I'll show you an example of what you can do with that. Throughout the pandemic, we've also used Survey 123 to collect some data from more of our emergency management stakeholders. So they're not necessarily members of the public, whether it's trying to track your resources in the field, if you're deploying a team of people to go do something, giving them a Survey 123 form that's really short form to fill out to say, here's where our team did work today. Or in the initial stages of the pandemic, we were trying to get some estimates of what sorts of funds are being expended as far as the FEMA Public Assistance Program goes. And so that was another simple form where it wasn't collecting a lot of data, but the data that it was collecting was reasonably useful to try to help decision makers understand the scope and severity of the impacts. Survey 123 as a tool is form centric. So the idea is that when you open it up, you're starting with a form, and usually there's a map component to it. There's some other tools even within the Arcgis ecosystem that are very map centric. But Survey 123 tends to be really accessible to a lot of users just because it's, even if it's a tool you haven't used before, the interface is usually easy to navigate and should be familiar to a lot of people. And for setting up a basic form, this is something that your GIS person can do using a web-based drag and drop interface. So especially if you're trying to collect some fairly basic data, it's easy to set up a form pretty quickly. And there are many other applications of data collection. These were some of the ones that I thought would be the most interesting to highlight. And we've seen many great examples of these from our local partners in the last couple of years. So I know many of you have already leveraged this a lot in your own jurisdictions, and I think that's really cool. Throughout especially in the early stages of the pandemic, I was trying to hold some GIS coordination calls with a lot of the GIS folks from around the community. And that was a great way for, on the technical side, to share some of the interesting tips and tricks that we had done. And I think it's worth giving another shout out to Utah County and the work that Peter's group had done there. They had a lot of really cool GIS applications that I was really impressed with, and Weber County as well had a lot of really cool forms and applications that they were able to share, especially in the early months of 2020. So certainly many of the examples that I'm going to show today are ones that I'm the most familiar with, but if you are also looking for other interesting GIS products from around the community. There's a lot of folks within our broader emergency management community around the state that have some really smart GIS people that are doing some really sophisticated things. And certainly they're always a great resource to reach out to those partners. Beyond data collection, kind of one of the core functions of GIS is to analyze data and then visualize it. In the previous set of screenshots, we had seen the public self-reporting damage form that I was showing from Davis County. And we were able to take the forms that we had seen from Davis County, Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake County and compile them just into like we only use this internally just to see, what were the photos that were being captured. The example on the left is a dashboard that Salt Lake County Emergency Management had put together in the immediacy of the Magna earthquake, where they had set up a similar public self-reporting form to get a better idea of the scope and severity of that event. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is that when you're setting up a form like this to collect data, particularly if you're getting data from the public, it has to be very clear in terms of what the different categories of damages are. Often people would say that the damage they're reporting was, something was completely destroyed. And as far as like the FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs go, destroyed is talking about a building or a residence. But we had a number of examples where, a tree fell over and it took out someone's fence and they marked that as destroyed. And there was a lot of less quality information that you had to sift through to really get the meaning that you're hoping to get. But a lot of these tools that are available also have some useful ways to provide examples of what those damage categories are to make it a little bit simpler for citizens, especially, to be able to understand quickly what it is that you're asking them for. Certainly, we've seen lots of examples of dashboards in the last couple of years, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. One of the other things that I don't have a screenshot for, but we've also seen examples of is using some of the GIS analytical tools to try to do some deeper analysis of what's happening. This could be for the pandemic, as an example. It could be things like trying to analyze, what percentage of the population can get to a vaccine provider within, half an hour's drive. And if you can identify locations where folks who want to get the vaccine can't access it easily, then that can potentially drive some decision making. Or we've seen a lot of interesting work coming out in the last couple of years trying to analyze, the socioeconomic effects of an incident on a population. And there's a lot of really useful GIS resources you can use to help facilitate that process to drive some more meaningful analytics in your EOC. And I don't mean to just gloss over this. I think if you have an event going on in your jurisdiction and you are wanting to do some of that analysis, that would be a great conversation to have with your GIS person in terms of what your essential elements of information are and what questions you're trying to answer so that you can drive that decision making. And I think based on all of the really interesting GIS products we've seen in the past couple of years, a lot of the GIS specialists in your communities probably have a lot of really good ideas for ways they can support you doing some of this analytical type of work. And I think they'd be well positioned to help you answer some of those questions that'll help you drive that decision making that you're looking for. In addition to collecting data and analyzing and visualizing it, we can also use GIS tools to share data and disseminate that. These are a few examples that we've seen. Many of you are familiar with the Risk Map program that Jamie Huff and Holly Strand work on out of our DEM office. And they've started using some GIS tools to more easily provide kind of a one-stop shop to get information and resources about that project, especially knowing that a risk map flood analysis will take multiple years and lots of input with community stakeholders. Our mitigation and recovery section has leveraged ArcGIS Hub. That's what this screenshot is showing, as a way to better communicate some of the guidance for the various FEMA programs, so that when you have an incident impacting you, you have an easier place to go to say, what are the FEMA requirements related to debris removal or tracking volunteer hours or whatever the case may be. And so one of the things that I think has really come along in the last couple of years related to GIS tools is that the examples that I'm showing here are not necessarily focused around showing things on a map. The screenshot in the lower right is an example from the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, where they have a hub site set up with a lot of data available so that folks in the emergency management community, regardless of whether they're internal or external stakeholders, can access data about different hazards, or if they're trying to collect data as part of maybe a mitigation planning process, they've got an easier way to find the data that is official and authoritative. And many of the data collectors that we'll see in a little bit are using tools like this to make their data easier to find and more accessible. And it's been really interesting to see how some of the GIS tools have matured to a point where it's allowing you as a user within the community to access data and start looking at it on your own. And some of it doesn't even require using a GIS specialist to do it. There's a lot of tools that you could do even just exploring data on your own, that doesn't really require any specialized software or skills. So it's been really neat to see the way that kind of the tools have caught up to a lot of the need in terms of making data and information easier to find, whether it's for citizens in your community or a lot of your internal stakeholders at various levels. So if you hear of anything related to ArcGIS Hub, that is one method for disseminating data. It's certainly not the only way you can do it, but it's one of the ways that has really picked up a lot of steam in the GIS community in the last few years. The last GIS application I wanted to touch on was being able to communicate disaster impacts. Many of us have been hearing a lot in the last couple of years about the FEMA lifelines, and the way that they've structured that as trying to analyze impacts to a community in terms of what's happening and what does that mean, and now what do we do about it. And there are a lot of interesting tools you can use to communicate not only what the impacts are for current incidents, but also ways that you can showcase the great work that your community has done for a previous response. Some of you might have heard of ArcGIS story maps, and that's what these are examples of. Story maps are a really accessible way to present map-based data where you can have a lot of narrative along with it, and you can include interesting graphics or something like that. And the example on the right comes also from the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, and I've really liked the way that they've produced some of these spotlight stories to highlight the work that they've been able to do. Some of their story maps don't go into a great deal of detail in terms of, this winter storm caused X million dollars of damage. Some of it is more just trying to highlight, here's what the impacts were, and here's how the state and local partners were able to respond to get the issues resolved as quickly as they could. And the story map as a tool is very visual. And so I think if you were in a situation where you needed to communicate with either elected officials or senior leadership within your organization, using a tool like this could be a great way to include a lot of those visual components to highlight the work that you've been able to do. The example on the left is a story map that we started in the early stages of the pandemic, working with our PIO in terms of just trying to capture the timeline of what were some of the major events and major decision points that happened. And this has been both a very useful reference for us as, I guess, kind of like a historical document, but also a way for us to show, citizens and the rest of our community what's going on and how the response has played out over time. I would recommend that, a story map is probably something that you would consider as, not something you do in the immediacy of an event. You'd be focused more on collecting data and trying to derive meaning from it. But when it comes time to communicate the significance of the actions that you've taken, a story map is a great way to do that. Out of all of the GIS tools that I'm touching on and highlighting, I think story maps are by far the easiest to use and require the least amount of technical expertise to put together. Creating a story map is a pretty simple drag and drop interface, and it's designed to be simple. So this is something that you wouldn't even necessarily need a GIS specialist to do. This is something that if you don't have the bandwidth to do it yourself, you could certainly try to see if someone else in your jurisdiction could help, because they're pretty easy to put together. So those are, broadly speaking, some of the applications of GIS in emergency management. Many of them are response-based, but they don't have to be. There's many other ways you can leverage GIS when it comes time to working on your local hazard mitigation plan, or trying to use some of these tools for some of your preparedness and outreach efforts as well. Certainly responses and recovery are the ones that come to mind the most, because that's where a lot of our attention goes. But there's a lot of really great tools out there that you can use and get them stood up fairly easily, I think. So that was kind of a broad picture of what some of the applications are of GIS and emergency management. And I wanted to move from there into highlighting some of the data feeds that are out there, particularly knowing that we wanted to focus this presentation around situational awareness. We've seen in any number of places an explosion in the amount of data that's out there and live feeds. And I wanted to spend a few minutes just highlighting some of the data that's out there, because if you work closely with your local GIS specialist, they may already be aware of many of these data feeds. So this may not be anything terribly new, but I think it's worth mentioning in terms of trying to highlight the awareness of organizations that produce data are doing a great job at trying to make that data easier for folks in the community to find and use, so that we don't have multiple copies of different data sets and trying to figure out which one is authoritative. So I wanted to highlight some of the data feeds that we have at DEM, We don't have a ton, but we do have a few that you might be interested in. And I suppose it's worth mentioning here that for all of the data feeds that I'm going to highlight and resources, I'll work with Jeff to send out the links to all of those, as well as the slide deck to this presentation, so that if you want to explore any of it on your own, you'll have the ability to do that. So there's some data feeds that we maintain here at DEM. There's a couple of other state agencies that have some really interesting data feeds that I think are worth highlighting. And there's also a tool called the Arcgis Living Atlas, which sounds like a bit of a buzzword because it is, but there's some really interesting feeds that Esri has compiled that I think would be really useful that you could start using today. And there's also a couple of other data feeds that I'd like to point out as well. So I don't have screenshots for all of these, but as far as data that we maintain at DEM, we've got a few data feeds that are kind of your status of X. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is many of you are familiar with the Web EOC platform, and many of you are also part of the jurisdiction that's part of the Web EOC implementation that we at DEM kind of support and maintain. And there is a tool within the Web EOC suite that allows you to connect Web EOC with ArcGIS. And as a GIS guy, I thought that was pretty cool. So this allows you to take like a status board within Web EOC, and you can turn that into a GIS data layer that you can bring into, dashboards or those sorts of applications. But you can also bring it into like a desktop GIS if you need your GIS specialist to do some more heavy GIS analysis. It's a great way to have that data coming from Web EOC and put it in a spot that you can use the same data in more places. Today is a Thursday, and so I think it's a Thursday. Yeah, it's Thursday today. And many of you are already familiar with the weekly briefings that our planning section sends out each week. And if you've ever looked through the weekly briefing and noticed there's a map of current incidents, that's one of the data layers that we maintain. Our current incident layer does not capture every single incident. That particular layer is more of a reflection of the incidents that we report on in the weekly briefing. So in general, if you see something reported in the weekly briefing, especially if it's a recent incident, then that will also be reflected in the current incidents map. If having a data layer like that would be of interest to you, we can certainly provide that. It's a public-facing map and a public-facing data layer, so that there's no special login or anything that you or your GIS person would need to have to start using that. A couple of the other status feeds that we have are directly connected to our Web EOC implementation. Is specifically looking at the declaration status in terms of which cities and counties are under a declaration of emergency. And then we also have a shelter status board and a commodity point of distribution status board. We have some other status boards in Web EOC, but the ones I've listed here are the ones that we've put the most work into making sure both the board in Web EOC as well as the corresponding data layer in ArcGIS are the most usable. And so these are also some feeds that we'll provide to you. And if you want to use them, you can. And some of them are also serve as kind of an interesting check in terms of being a reflection of what we in the state EOC are looking at. And if you look at that and say, wait a minute, this doesn't match with what we're seeing locally, that's a great way for us to have a better understanding of when we need to update one of our feeds to to match what you're reporting locally. But some of the other data feeds that you might be interested in come from some of our other state agencies. There's a number of state agencies that have very robust GIS implementations. I'm only going to highlight a couple of them here, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. During wildfire season, our partners at the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands have a public wildfire dashboard, which also integrates with some of the other live feeds that are out there to capture new wildfire starts, and that it also updates to provide more status information about the size of the fire and the percentage containment. And if you go to the Utah Fire Info website that many of you are familiar with, you've probably already seen the active fire map, but within that active fire map, there's another tab on that map that reflects the dashboard that I've taken a screenshot of on the right. And that one is kind of your year-to-date summary. So that's a really cool resource that they've made available. And that could be really easy for you to consume in your own local GIS applications. The other one that I thought was interesting was from the Utah Division of Water Resources. They worked with a lot of stakeholders to produce a data layer of where the culinary water provider system boundaries are. Certainly this is more of a static layer that you would want to consume in an application. So it's less of a data feed because it's not providing any sort of status of that water supplier. But certainly in many incidents, we've had some concerns over who are the water providers in this affected area. And the partnership that Water Resources put together, it took them, I think, a couple of years to really compile all of that data into a single data layer. And it's a great resource, and I think it would be something that you could use pretty easily. I don't know if they have a corresponding data layer for wastewater provider system boundaries. I think they had discussed that, but if that data layer exists, I'm not aware of it. But the folks at Water Resources are great to work with, and they've got lots of other interesting water-related data through some of their data portals as well. As far as like an emergency response perspective goes, I think one of the more interesting things for you would be the data feeds that are available through the ArcGIS Living Atlas. Living Atlas does kind of seem more like a buzzword, but as a compilation of data layers, it has really matured in the last few years to the point where the folks at Esri who make ArcGIS have worked with a lot of data providers like the National Weather Service and USGS and others to get live feeds of the data that they produce. So there's really good data feeds for earthquakes, both in terms of showing the point on the map where an earthquake happened, as well as the shake map that can be produced if an event is large enough to merit a shake map. There's data for stream gauges and the wind speed at some of the wind stations that are available. The Weather Service has a lot of data out there. Their data feeds are quite extensive. These screenshots are just a list of some, but they're easy to use and they're updated frequently. So one of the data feeds that we consume on our current incident map are the Weather Service active watches and warnings. So if you see our current incident map that's on the homepage of our website, it's whenever the Weather Service issues a watch or a warning, it will show up on that map. And that's the great thing about some of these live feeds is that you can use them without needing to do anything to the data, and your map will just stay up to date. There's a lot of really good data feeds in the ArcGIS Living Atlas, and I think if you're working with your GIS specialist to try to create maybe like a local dashboard of what's happening in your community, your GIS person's probably familiar with some of these feeds, but if they aren't, it's a great way to capture some situational awareness data that you might want to know about. Some of the other feeds that I'll touch on very briefly, another ArcGIS data layer that's out there is they've worked with the EPA and Air Now to capture air monitoring data for air quality, which is certainly relevant to us this time of year. There's data from the Civil Air Patrol. Whenever the Civil Air Patrol is tasked with a mission and they capture images from their missions around the country, they've got a portal that has their data available. The one in the upper right is the Empower map by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. That's got a lot of really interesting data about individuals who are on electrically dependent medical equipment, at least as funded through Medicare. And they've got some really great data that you can use as well. I also wanted to highlight the National Shelter System that is I believe, a partnership between FEMA and the Red Cross. The National Shelter System data is separate from our web EOC feed of shelter status. And it would also be a good resource for you to use, especially when it comes to capturing data related to shelters that are being managed by the Red Cross. So I'm sure that's a lot of information to take in, but just as a reminder, I'll make sure that Jeff has links to all of these that are shared with you so that you don't have to try to take screen grabs or write them all down. So one of the most common applications of GIS related to emergency management is damage assessment. And as far as damage assessment goes, there's a few tools that I thought were worth highlighting, and we'll touch on each of these in turn. The first one I wanted to highlight are Survey 123 templates that FEMA produces for their individual assistance and public assistance programs as far as a preliminary damage assessment goes. This is not like a windshield assessment type of form. This is more geared toward the types of information that would be collected as part of a joint preliminary damage assessment between you at the local level as well as the state and FEMA. So these templates are free and out there for you to use. Certainly over our experiences in the last couple of years, we've recognized that there are lots of different programs out there for disaster assistance. And outside of the FEMA programs, one of the more common ones that we've interacted with is the Small Business Administration. And in talking with our mitigation and recovery folks, I've gotten the impression that the type of data that SBA is looking for is similar, but in some ways slightly different from what maybe the FEMA programs are concerned with. These templates from FEMA are out there and great to use, but it's also a template that is has some flexibility so that if you want to collect additional information that's not already part of the existing template, your GIS person can work on that as well. We've been in some discussions over the past few months about trying to have a more standardized statewide damage assessment tool and template. We're not at a point where we have anything really shareable yet, but that's something that we've been mindful of and trying to work with some of our local partners on producing. I also wanted to highlight another tool that you might have heard of called Quick Capture. Quick Capture is another ArcGIS app that's, you would kind of think of it as like a fat button app, where it's even simpler than a form. The idea is that it's very minimal user interaction, and if you're driving around trying to size up an incident, Quick Capture gives you an easy way to say, this residence was minor damaged or major damage or affected. The screenshot that I'm showing here is for Urban Search and Rescue. The National Alliance for Public Safety GIS Foundation, that's a mouthful. The acronym is pronounced NAPSIG, but I believe NAPSIG and FEMA had worked together on some of these search and rescue templates that are designed to be super simple to use, but they're great for capturing data in the field. So that's something, if you interact with the search and rescue folks in your community, these templates would certainly be worth looking at. I also wanted to highlight a template that the Central U.S. Earthquake Consortium, or CUSEC, produced related for rapid visual screening. Some of you may be familiar with the ATC-20 post-earthquake building safety inspection class that John Crofts and Bob Carey from our office have been getting some folks trained up on for a few years. This template that I'm showing here is a Survey 123 template for that form. This is brushing the edge of my expertise, but my understanding is that the P-154 form is the pre-incident building evaluation, and then the ATC-20 version of the form is for a post-incident. But if you're familiar with the ATC-20 class and the types of data and information that you're trying to collect through that process, this rapid visual screening app and form would be a great place to start. And again, I'll make sure you have links to this as well. So that was a lot of material, and now that we've covered all of these applications and data feeds and what you can do for damage assessment, now what? So a few things that I think would be easy for you to do in coordination with your GIS person is trying to leverage some of those live feeds in a dashboard, just so you can get more eyes on what's happening in your community. You could deploy a damage assessment template and start running with that. And I think really one of the easiest things you could do if you want to inform your stakeholders of, the impacts to your community and the level of effort that your response constituted for an event, I think a story map is a great way to start using those tools easily and hopefully build a lot of your GIS use cases from there. So we've seen infinitely many dashboards in the last couple of years. This is a screen grab from the Johns Hopkins COVID tracking dashboard that I'm sure you've all seen. And we've seen so many dashboards, it's hard to know how to derive value from those dashboards, knowing that everybody's got a dashboard now. This is an example of a dashboard that we maintained at DEM in partnership with the State Department of Health for about a year and a half of the COVID response. This was tracking information related to the effects of COVID on long-term care facilities. And it got to the point where we looked at this and, in coordination with the Department of Health, we're thinking like, okay, so now that the numbers are so big, what does that mean? And how do we, drive decision-making or know what actions to take? So in this example, we were just showing raw numbers. how many total positive residents were there, and how many positive healthcare workers were there. But along with the FEMA Lifelines methodology, it got to a point where it was like, so what? It's big and it's bad, but what does that mean? So one of the things that we worked with them to refine this dashboard, so this is another iteration of the same dashboard, instead of focusing on raw numbers, we were trying to show change over time in terms of, what are the net effects today? And we worked with them in addition to a list and a map. We were able to graph out some of those changes over time so you could see trends. And that showing those trends are a lot more meaningful, both to you as an emergency manager, so you can see, is the situation in my community improving or not, but also helping hopefully drive decision making. So that this is one example, certainly the example I had the most readily on hand, but I think it's worth considering, just knowing that if you have an incident that lasts, for a few days to, a week or two, or in the case of something like COVID, where it's gone on for a couple of years, you're having people who are looking at this data daily or weekly or with some level of frequency, and the tools that you're using to communicate need to be able to highlight, what's changed and why is that data still relevant and meaningful. So I think this was, when dashboards really started being used a lot, it was like, let's just put data on a dashboard. But I think really one of the key takeaways is that if you're creating a dashboard, it should be geared toward being a decision support tool. And similar, it's a contrived example, but I really would liken it to the dashboard in your car. It provides a lot of information and you can look at it when you need to, but the information there is then what causes you to decide whether your check engine light means anything. Hopefully it does. Hopefully you're not fixing your check engine light by putting a Post-it note over it so you don't see it anymore, though I have heard of people who do that. But I think if you're trying to think of how you would want to have a dashboard in your EOC to help you do what you do during a response, the best way that you can help your GIS person create something that actually works for you is to think of it in terms of those decision points that you might have. And I guess what I mean is, if you have some event and you open a shelter and there's 50 people, so what? Is that 50 people out of 300 people in your community, or is it 50 people out of 200,000 people in your city? And I think if you can try to present that information so that it has more context behind it, then it's a lot easier to understand, if you're at a decision point where you would need to bring in more resources. And certainly as a GIS person who's trying to build and support, these tools, I don't want to be the one that makes a decision or that shows data in such a way that it makes you make a decision in a certain way. But my goal is to know what decisions that you're trying to make, so that when you need to make the decision, or someone, policy level person in your organization needs to make a decision, they have all of the data and information they need so that they can do that. I think this is really where I've kind of connected well with the FEMA Lifelines methodology in terms of, so what does this impact mean? And trying to think of the data points from that point of view. I think in terms of other takeaways, deploying a damage assessment template is an easy way to start collecting information. And if you want to just get some quick information from citizens in your community, don't give them the full FEMA template for individual assistance or public assistance, because that form's like a mile long. But, this example from Salt Lake County Emergency Management was one that they put out in the immediacy of the earthquake. And I think they were able to get quite a few responses of where the damage was, just to get some better situational awareness on what was happening in their community. And I thought that was really cool. And the folks at Salt Lake County Emergency Management have come up with a lot of really good GIS products and tools that I think would be worth checking out. And I think that the last thing in terms of what you can do today is just make a story map. Whether this is something that your GIS person does or you assign to someone else in your office, I think story maps are a great visual way to say, here's what happened in our community, and here's what we did about it. And here's why that's meaningful, because we need, all of the resources for our emergency management program to be able to respond in this way for future incidents. I don't think that story maps are the only way that you could communicate those sorts of applications in your community. But if you're interested in leveraging GIS, I think a story map is a great way to go, just to start at ground level, so to speak. There's my contact information. I'm sure Jeff will also include that in the materials that get distributed following the presentation. And I'm really thankful that I've had the chance to share this with you. And I think with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Hey, thanks, Josh. Hey, we have a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions for Josh? So you can just unmute and ask. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, Josh, it's Kathy McMullen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
So I have a quick question as a very basic ArcGIS user. If I have a website for my EM, can I easily integrate a story map onto that website, or do I just need to link to the ArcGIS story map, or can I really integrate it well?
That's a great question. Yeah, you can definitely embed that in your own website. There's a few different ways you could do it. For story maps and dashboards and those sorts of things, they do have an easy way to grab the embed code so that you can drop them into your website. And I think that's a great way to do it. One of the things that we have had some growing pains about related to using these GIS tools is trying to make sure that it's easily understood that those materials are official. And I think if you can embed that story map or other product just right into your website, that's a great way to keep that level of continuity so that everyone in your community knows that that's an official product from you.
Sure. Can I follow it up with one more question?
Sure.
So I want to integrate the quick capture stuff with our search and rescue in Summit County. I think it's a great tool. I've used it with Task Force 1, but the costs have been really exorbitant. If a community doesn't have never-ending users that you can put quick capture on, is there any other resources to expand that? Can we tap into state resources for that if there's an event and we need more quick capture accounts if we don't have unlimited?
Absolutely. One of the tools that we have at DEM that we acquired in the last couple of years, in addition to using ArcGIS Hub that we had shown in some of the slides, as a product, ArcGIS Hub has the concept of community users. And within the scope of that licensing, it's possible for us at DEM to provide some community user accounts that could be used both for if you at a local level are working with us, but I think it would be okay to use those for some of your local response efforts as well. We don't have an infinite number of accounts, but I think there are a number of projects that we've been working on that we're hoping to use some of that capability so that on a local level you would have more access to those accounts. So I think in terms of your specific use case, Catherine, it would probably be best to send me an email so we can flesh that out. But the short answer is that we do have access to some resources that we could provide to give you some of that capability.
Sounds good. Thanks, Josh. I'm going to get in a little deeper with my ArcGIS guys, and then I'll reach out to you when I have better information. So thank you.
Sure thing.
Hey, this is Mark. I've got a question, and Kathy, this may apply to you too. But the information when you use DEM that you did the scrape work through your sources for local community infrastructure and facilities and things like that. Significant information for mapping, come in advance community resources and stuff. Do we know if that same type of source of information's available for updates, since you did that with us back in 2016, I think?
Yeah, it's been a while, Mark. I would reach out to Braden Norris. I'm sure that he is working to update that stuff, and they've updated the tool that we were using for scoring. And I would defer to Josh for map scraping updates that we can do. But yeah, I would hope Braden Norris has been maintaining those and working with each county to get that updated.
Give me the name again.
Braden Norris. He's at State DEM.
Okay.
I think it's bnorris at utah.gov.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
Mark, the other thing is that Matt Beaudry, our PSA, can really be helpful specific to the county too.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
And just to tag on to that, we have been working with Braden at DEM on the critical infrastructure scoring tool, and we're not yet ready to go live with it, but we do intend for that to be leveraged in an ArcGIS environment so that it'll be more straightforward to update and score that infrastructure. And I suppose it's also worth mentioning, the crux of my presentation was related to incident data feeds or feeds of where stuff is happening. But there's also a lot of great data feeds or data sources out there for infrastructure. I'll make sure that Jeff has the links to send out to the group. But there's a lot of partners at the state and federal level that have collected some infrastructure data that is publicly available and easy to share and easy to use. Specifically thinking of some of the utilities like electrical transmission lines or substations. I think those are both on the Highfield Open site. There's a few others that I can't think of off the top of my head, but I'll make sure you have links to those as well.
Hey, perfect. Hey, thanks, Josh. Hey, Mark, just FYI, I dropped Braden's email in the chat, so you can send him an email. Hey, in lieu of time, we're going to close. Josh, thanks so much for being on and presenting. Appreciate it. The next webinar will be on, I wonder what information I'll find on the new Utah Risks Map website. Holly Strand will be our presenter. If any of you have any I wonder topic suggestions, please reach out to me at jeffrankham@utah.gov to have your topic added to our calendar. We're always excited to help you explore and get to know all that DEM can offer the emergency management community. And with that, until next time, keep wondering. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks, everyone.